Diversity and Inclusion at the Chattanooga Area Chamber of Commerce. First, we'd like to welcome you to our third installment of the Lean In Women Groundbreakers storytelling series. Over the past few weeks, we've recognized the challenges that local women have faced in immigration and education. And we honor each and every speaker who has had the courage and tenacity to tell their stories of triumph. We want to first thank our sponsors, Humanities Tennessee, American Diversity Report, the Concierge Office Suites, the Chattanooga Chamber, particularly the Midtown Council, Bridge Financial Services, Southern Adventist University, Dream Central, and Journey Educational Services. And we especially want to thank the Ridgeview Baptist Church, who opened their doors so that we could have this program. Now, today, we will inspire, amaze, and hopefully persuade you to tell your own stories about what it means to grow up during the Civil Rights era. We thank you for the overwhelming response and participation. So let's get started. What does civil rights mean to you? For many of our young people who were born after 1968, some 48 years ago, it's probably an internet search about the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and the marches. It may be about a movie, possibly Malcolm X, maybe Mississippi Burning, or it could be a Samuel L. Jackson feature, A Time to Kill. Maybe it's about the Black Lives Matter movement, which is sparked by young people. But what does civil rights mean to Chattanooga and to Chattanoogans? Well, is it about just black people? Is it about women? Is it about the rights of people who are in the LGBT community? And is it just about the United States? For our first speaker, Deborah Levine, it's a global struggle that has led her to become the woman she is today. Ladies and gentlemen, Deborah Levine.
So the story of the Women Groundbreakers begins on the 24 square miles of Bermuda, where my family has been the only Jewish family to have lived and worked on the island for 4 generations. When my great-grandfather originally came as a tailor to Trimmingham's on the island, the Bermuda government was not particularly open for Jewish people. Yes, there were hotels and golf courses that did not permit Jews. During World War II, leading up to it, hotels would not allow Jewish tourists. The original white families who ruled made sure that only landowners could vote until 1964, and that women couldn't vote until after World War II. We were not Bermuda citizens despite having been there forever, so we couldn't vote. Now, my grandfather was kind of a wheeling, dealing kind of guy, so we did own some property. And we felt that our situation was far better than compared to the racial segregation of the island, housing and education and employment that I grew up with in the 1950s. So in the early days, my grandfather was a peddler on a horse and buggy and would sell anything and everything from shoes to pianos, and he would cross racial lines, and he was able to go from the most oldest Bermuda family to the poorest white. And when he had his first building of the Stop and Shop shopping mall, which was so tiny we didn't have a parking lot because we didn't need it. We didn't have legal cars till 1948. He made sure it was on the border of the capital and the black community so everyone could stop and shop. So it's natural for me to cross lines through, though segregation was everywhere. Black kids went to public schools, white kids went to private schools, black kids sat in the cheap balcony seats at the theater. We white kids were supposed to sit in the ground floor and pay extra for the privilege, which I thought wasn't fair, so I bought the cheap seats and extra candy for everybody, went up to the balcony, and we all pigged out happily. So the habits of crossing boundaries stuck with me when we moved to New York. My dad, who had been a military intelligence officer during World War II, seeing the camps in Germany, was determined that we would have a Jewish life. And we ended up in Great Neck, New York, which is 95% Jewish, or it was back then. In those days, in the 60s, many of my Jewish high school friends worked in the civil rights movement in many ways. The older ones would go down and march in Manhattan, and they ended up in jail. Us younger ones would march more locally, and I ended up on the front page of the Great Neck newspaper with a wonderful caption that said, "Pimple politics." Okay, so I neglected to tell my father about that one, but he found the newspaper, took one look, turned purple, and I held my breath, and he was angry, but not at me, at the newspaper. How dare they insult you? All right. So the Jewish community has had a long history in terms of civil rights, including beginning with the NAACP. But we were also in the women's movement, and it was then when I was old enough to go down to Manhattan to march in the 1970 Women's Liberation Parade, march, however you want to call it, led by Jewish women like Gloria Steinem and Betty Friedan. But my first love was creating, not protesting. So I studied with a former star of the Alvin Ailey Dance Company, which, as you know or may know, is one of the first African-American classical ballet companies in New York. And I used arts to bridge our differences. In the 1980s in Chicago, I created a master's degree in urban planning that would do just that, use the arts to build bridges. And I also used, of course, my Jewish heritage, joining the Chicago's Black Jewish Dialogue and coordinating Black Jewish Seminarians conferences. So when I came here to Chattanooga almost 20 years ago to run the Jewish Federation, of course, I brought my passion for diversity with me. And one of the things that I created was some Black Jewish programming at the Bessie Smith Hall, and I don't know how many of you know LaFonda McGee. Yes, so she and I became good friends as we promoted and created these programs. And we created together the Women's Council on Diversity. And the Women GroundBreakers, who are sitting here today, is an offshoot of that Council on Diversity, as is the American Diversity Report, with interviews of famous Chattanoogans who had been prominent in the civil rights movement, like Ruth Holmberg and the Reverend Paul McDaniel. And don't be surprised if you're sitting out there and you get a call from me asking for interviews. I'm shameless. So the Women GroundBreakers has made a difference over the years, inspiring collaborations. But I know it hasn't always been smooth sailing. And I want to share with you the example of Bermuda. And I had a conversation with a group on racial equality just 2 days ago that reminded me that racial issues in that small island have always been up and down. So when I took my baby, it is 30 years ago, to Bermuda to visit my grandmother, we got caught in a general island strike. It brought down transportation. There was none. Garbage piled up on the sides of the road and was set on fire. It was dangerous. and we couldn't get off the island, except our lifelong friends in the Black community protected us, got us to the airport, where I ran on the tarmac with my baby in my hands to the last plane that would leave the island for weeks. And I wouldn't return for another 15 years. I have gone back, I have written the history of Bermuda Jews for them, but one of the things that stays in my mind is it is a microcosm of what happens between different groups, and how the African American community and the Jewish community need to stay on the same path together.